Welcome to the Thriving Farmer Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Kilpatrick. Our mission is to inspire, educate, and celebrate sustainable farming. We believe that you can build a profitable, sustainable farm that gives you true farm freedom. Join us as we talk to farmers, innovators, educators, and entrepreneurs to glean their top takeaways in business and life. Steward is transforming agriculture by equipping regenerative farms and food systems with the capital they need to grow. As a mission-driven financial partner, Steward works closely with agriculture businesses to scale their operations, improve the health of their lands and waters, and bolster farm-to-regional food systems. To date, Steward has provided over $15 million in business loans to fund 75 unique projects, backed by more than 1,500 participating lenders. Steward is proud to be a certified B Corp. Seek financing or support a loan campaign at gosteward.com. This podcast is brought to you by GrownBy. Join farmers from across the U.S. who are selling direct on the first cooperatively owned sales app, GrownBy. You can easily manage CSAs of any scale, organize your spring plant sales, move that freezer meat, or even sell wholesale on GrownBy. Farm shops are free to build with lots of inventory options. You can accept credit cards and offline payments, and their pick lists and pack sheets do the job. Customers will get automated notifications on orders, refunds, and pickups. There is no startup fees, no monthly or yearly subscriptions, no additional charge for tech support. The only cost is a small co-op service charge for online processing. However, as a listener of the Thriving Farmer podcast, you get 50% off your first 3 months of co-op service charges on GrownBy. Email their very friendly farmer support team at grow@farmgenerations.coop to get this offer. Check it out at grownby.com or download the app on the Google Play or Apple App Stores. GrownBy, the farmer-owned marketplace. Hey, Thriving Farmers, Michael Kilpatrick here with another episode of the Thriving Farmer podcast. And today my guest is Eric Sannerud, who is a hop evangelist. Eric first fell in love with hops as a co-founder and farmer CEO of Mighty Axe Hops, a fully integrated hop farm and marketing company which grew and sold 80 acres of hops in Minnesota. He then went on to be the hop brand manager for Brewers Supply Group. He is now a freelance hop consultant for brewers, farmers, and marketers across the United States. Welcome, Eric.
Hey, Michael.
Share with us a little bit about, what got you to become a hop evangelist.
I am in love with the plant. I love hops. I love the world that they bring us. My amazement with them today, nearly more than a decade since discovering them, kind of remains the same. It's this single hop, the single plant can and does produce flowers with a range of aroma and flavor expressions that is fascinating. I've always been fascinated by scent and aroma, particularly of natural sources, like a plum tree or an apple blossom. The aroma that they have and the way that connects to our experience and our memory, and hops do that for me every time.
Yeah. Did you get interested as you started drinking beer, or what was kind of like the first introduction to them?
Yeah, the first introduction to hops was, liking craft beer, learning about craft beer, liking Ranger IPA from New Belgium. For all those old school craft beer drinkers out there, that was my first real IPA experience. And that's what sucked me in. It was like, well, I love the way these things taste. Could I grow them in Minnesota?
Yeah. So why don't you give folks a little bit of an overview of the plant and then kind of like the growth cycle for that, because it's a little bit different than a lot of crops most people are considering.
Yeah, there's a lot of different things about hops.
Yeah.
So from a very 10,000 foot level, they're a perennial crop for starters. They're perennial. For second, they grow in a trellis, but like a very tall trellis. If you imagine wine grapes, I think people are very familiar with that, but much taller, usually 18 feet here in the States. And being a perennial crop, they have a cycle of activity and from a farmer's perspective, labor needs that are really unique. In a annual crop, there's generally a consistent work of labor, planting, harvest. With the perennial crop like hops, in the spring they grow, and then there's a lot of labor required to train them to a string. They must be trained to grow up. And then there's kind of this growing period, slower labor, and then there's harvest, which is incredibly intense. Even if you mechanize it to some extent. Harvest for hops is a roughly 30-day window.
Yeah.
Depending on your volume of hops, you have to harvest a lot of long hours and days, both picking, drying, and then pelleting or otherwise processing and packaging your hops.
Yeah. So then there's also machines that can help you with parts of that too, especially like picking the flowers.
Yep, hop picking machines come in all sizes and sorts for all different sizes of farms. And really, after picking, you need to dry them. And after drying, you need to package them. And after you package them, you might need to pellet them. And so there's a lot of processing that goes into making a hop that you might grow ready for a brewer.
Yes. Because most brewers are using they want a dried pellet, or do some use fresh?
Yeah, so dried pellet or dried hops are the other primary way that brewers use hops. It's 99% of beer is using that. But some brewers and some beers on a seasonal basis use wet hops or fresh hops, like you mentioned.
Yep.
And those are hops that have been harvested but not dried. Those hops need to be used almost immediately. And there, of course, that makes them a very seasonal product. Hops will wilt if left, or rot really, if left out and not in a drying environment. Kind of like if you had I always tell people, imagine picking a head of lettuce and then leaving it in the sun in the field and coming back an hour later.
Yes. Yeah. To be wilted right down. Gotcha. Now, hops, from what I understand, also have some medicinal compounds. Well, I mean, they have the flavonoid. Is it xanthohumol?
Yeah. Yep. That's in there. There's a lot of cool chemicals in hops, and different hops have different ratios of these. People use hops, obviously for beer, right? That's where all the hops go functionally. But people also use hops for herbal remedies. You know, there's you can use them to help fall asleep. You can use them in other teas and tinctures for various uses. They have a strong preservative effects. They are the preservative in beer, and so certain slices of hop extract can also be used to preserve, natural body care products. I think the deodorant that I use has hops on the label, and that's what it's doing in there. I wish it smelled like hops. It smells good, but
yeah. Very cool. So then lots of things. So there are some people that are then putting it into things besides beer, is what you're saying.
Yes, but from like a market standpoint, it's less than half of 1%. It's all hops that are grown go to beer.
Yeah. Gotcha. So let's talk a little bit about your farm story, because I know you're actively not doing that now. So let's talk a little bit about starting that farm, because you guys were 80 acres of hops, is a tremendous amount of hops.
It is a tremendous amount of hops, at least for the Midwest here in Minnesota. The journey was a long one, and the story of getting into farming is different for everybody. This was the kind of second crop that I got interested in, and the only reason I was able to get into it and start with, we started with 25 plants, and at 80 acres it was 80,000 plants. It was just because there was my grandparents still happened to live on a part of the family farm that hadn't been sold or turned into a highway, and so there was space available. I'll never forget their support, letting me go out there and just screw around, no idea what I was doing, and that was a lot of years of not really knowing what we were doing, and learning by doing, learning as we go, until we expanded significantly at our own separate farm.
Yeah. So then, and when you started, were you messing around with a lot of different varieties? What was kind of like the R&D process to go from 25 plants to the 80,000 or 80 acres? And I don't know how many thousand plants that was.
Yeah. 80,000 plants. Yep. It's looking back, I wish that we had R&D'd for another, 18 years or whatever to really try to learn something, but that's not how reality goes. We started with just Cascade, the most common hop plant. And if people out there are thinking about growing a hop, that's one of the first ones I'd recommend. It's pretty resilient. It's pretty flexible. Mm-hmm. It's common. It's known to brewers and people who brew beer. And it just behaves really quite well in most climates. So we started with just a bunch of Cascade, then added a couple more, and then we went to 80. We were at about 10 or 12 varieties, but I'm not going to
Yep.
name them all for you. Some of them were real stinkers. Some of them were all-stars. And that's another thing to consider if you're thinking about growing hops out there is, as a perennial plant, choosing a variety and planting it takes them a few years to get to full maturity. So you're investing a lot. It's not only a lot of cost in the plants themselves, which can be, $3 a plant. You're investing a lot of labor into planting them, and then you're investing a lot of time and kind of waiting and nurturing them until they get to a kind of a commercial viable yield for you. That picking the right varieties is immensely important.
Yeah. Now with hops too is because you have to trellis them and all that per plant, what's the spacing generally that's used?
So we did 3 to 3.5 feet per plant in the row.
Yep.
Different people will do different things. The closer they go together, the more disease pressure you're going to invite. The main challenges for hops are downy and powdery mildew from a fungal perspective. And so moisture is your enemy on the plant. And so good airflow, good sunlight penetration is important for some natural deterrence to those diseases.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, so we've got that. And then the trellising for like a lot of people using telephone poles or just, rot resistant cedar and locust.
Yeah, it depends on the scale. There's commercial scale people are using ag treated pine. So not telephone poles. There's all sorts of stuff on telephone poles that can poison your soil or hurt the plants. And then at a smaller scale, when we first started, we found a logger who had a bunch of the correct length tamarack, and we used tamarack, and those are still standing in the ground now 12 years later. So
all right, so the rot resistant. And then what can an average hop plant produce for yield?
Totally depends on the variety and the season and the maturity. Anywhere from, and this is going to be in dry because no one really measures in wet yield. And your climate and where you are, it could be 0.5 pound, it could be 2 pounds, could be 3 pounds per string. Per plant, sorry. So in a lot of systems, hops are strung with 2 strings per plant. Instead of 1, and so per string is anyway.
Gotcha. That's way if you do 2 strings, you get them to spread out a little bit more instead of up just 1 string.
You get that V pattern that if y'all go and look up, hop fields on the internet, you'll see like this V-ing shape, and that is just the plant can produce more than enough material to get yield off of 2 strings versus just 1. There are different ways that people do it. Some have 4 strings per hill and different kind of ways to lay out your yard. But ultimately, your limiting factor is generally not how many strings you put your plant on. It's it's nutrient availability, it's water, it's genetic.
So what kind of soils do hops like?
It'd be lighter is better.
Lighter
is better. When we first grew hops, there was on basically straight sand, which had its own challenges, but we also we have very little water related disease pressure. They want good soil. It needs to be well draining. It should not be wet or heavy. The richer the better. They are hungry plants. They need a lot to achieve commercial yields. Of course, that depends on your goals with the plant, but they are very demanding plants to successfully cultivate.
Gotcha. All right, so lots of fertility. And then what time of year is the harvest? Is that like September, or where you guys were? You're very far north, so it might have been maybe even earlier.
Yeah, it's interesting. We're right in the band. It's about the 47th parallel that most hops are kind of genetically suited for. Their important maturity dates are based on sunlight. And so the timing of sunlight and then a little bit of heat is what's going to define the length of your season. So for us in Minnesota, much like most of the Northern Hemisphere, our harvest begins in mid to late August and wraps up by the end of September. Like maturity of the hops, I should say. And that's the hop harvest season. But if you're in different spaces, the further you go south, that can get a little earlier because the heat and the sunlight intensity will push the hop to move into maturity, to enter the process of creating flowers sooner.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay. And so what you mentioned fertility requirements, what were you using to put down? Was that just like composted chicken manure or lots of compost?
Yeah, we were not organic
Okay.
production, so we were using traditional sources of nitrogen.
Okay.
Um, there's hops are an example of a crop that for commercial production organic is significantly more difficult. There's it's not exact, I don't know carrots as well, for example, right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem to me, based on my experience at the store or talking with other farmers, that it's significantly different. Like hops, you almost guaranteed to lose yield. You have significantly more labor expense. um, it's a real challenge
Mm.
to grow hops, or with the big O organic, at least. I mean, there's a
Yeah.
lot you
Yeah.
can do within it to be more
Hmm.
uh, uh, conscious and responsible. I mean, there's an interesting thing with hops, and at the larger industry level is, in some spaces it's like, I don't care if it's organic or not. It's just got to be the cheapest potato, right?
Yeah.
Whatever it
Yeah.
might be to
Yeah.
produce. And in hops, there's very interesting research and experience with that folks have, drawing lines between some of the more harsh
Yes.
chemicals that can be used in a non-organic system, and then influence on the hops quality, which is ultimately, because hops are a market where it's all about, does someone think this smells or tastes good? It's a lot
Yes.
more subjective than how many pounds of potatoes that I yield per acre. So it's really cool to see how that characteristic of the hop plant and the end use, the end market for hops being so interested in these kind of subjective quality aspects, allows farmers more space, or creates more incentive for farmers to say, hey, I'm going to invest in soil health. I'm not going to spray super harsh
Hmm.
chemicals, because I see how that impacts, these softer aspects. No one cares what a potato, well, a lot of us do care what potatoes taste like,
Yeah.
but ultimately it's got to be
Yes.
cheap, right?
Yeah.
That's what potatoes are for. It's cheap and sit on the shelf. So it's just kind of cool to think about it that way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So let's move into that's something you mentioned right there, which is like subjective profile. But let's move into the marketing side. So when you were growing hops, where were your sales outlets?
Yeah, it can be tricky. It depends on the scale of what sort of folks are available to you. When we first started growing, it was uh we had like met some people who had just started breweries, and so neither of us really knew what we were doing. And
Yeah.
they purchased some from us, and there were some more experienced brewers who just like believed in the idea of local and wanted to support us.
Yep.
We're forever indebted to them, giving us the time and space to learn and educate us. Um, you could also be selling to home brewers. I know there's one thing that is really tricky when you're just getting into hops, is just how much you have to know and how much you have to learn about
Mm.
them.
Yeah.
Is so overwhelming that for people thinking about it, I would really recommend, like, what is the smallest amount that you can get away with to learn kind of something about, what's the smallest amount of investment that you wouldn't care if you never made a dollar off it.
Yeah.
um, because the chances of growing sellable quality hops at a scale that pays for themselves, that takes a lot of investment, and it might take many years
Mm.
to get there, to learn and develop. So we were selling to local brewers and to some home brewers, um, but they were all kind of doing us a favor,
Mm.
in the early years.
Yeah. And so then as you scaled up, was it more going to just shipping across the nation?
Yeah, as we scaled up, it continued to be primarily Minnesota.
Okay.
Local brewers wanting to support the local hop farm, um, and that still remained, the bulk of our sales.
Okay. And let's talk for someone looking to get in. Where do you think the sweet spot is? Is there a place for a small grower to get into doing hops? Is it something that should just be super local?
It's really tricky. There's so much to discuss and talk about. Like, what do you think would be, what are your goals, is really where I try to start with people. Like, what do you want from this? Is this
Yeah.
because you want to grow a crop that you think is cool? Is this because you think beer is cool and you want to be related to it? Is it because you want to earn a living, or
Yeah.
part of a living, or an entire income from hops that really is going to, change your investment? It's a little bit different than saying, like, hey, I want to grow my own potatoes this year. Like, go out, get
Yeah.
seed potatoes, plant, look up, put them in hay bale, whatever. With hops, the infrastructure investment alone, is significant. So really knowing what you want out of it. I think it could be tricky, though, if you wanted to do it. I don't think hops work very well as an enterprise, like being part of your farm enterprise. Like, you also do other things They're
Yeah.
very demanding at certain times of year, and then they're very demanding as far as the effort that it takes to, sell them or learn about them. I've spent almost 12 years now
Mhm.
in hops, working on hops, learning about hops, and there's still more. It's an immense space. There's always more to learn about hops. But that said, too, depending on your farm operation, maybe you have a pick your own thing going already. Maybe you're already familiar with some perennial crops and trellising. Maybe there's a way to find a hop that performs well on a smaller trellis that's maybe very similar to the wine grape trellis you have. And you could have a row or two of hops that you can offer PYO for, something like that. There's
Yeah.
ways. I've seen creative ways that people have tried to implement hops into an aspect of their farm enterprise, and some have found success. It seems like it's worth the time at least.
Yeah. Now the U-Picks, I think that sounds interesting to me, because that's one of the things that we're trying to just keep expanding on our acreage. Because they're so tall, do you typically just like slowly lower the vines as people start U-picking? I'm just interested if you have any more experience with that.
Yeah, when we first started, everything was hand picked. We did picking parties, which was a lot of fun. We'd have a brewer bring some beer out. We'd put some fresh hops into the beer, and people could drink beer and eat some broths or whatever, and hand pick our harvest for us.
Yeah.
But it's fun. I mean, it's fun to be hands-on with hops. Like I said, they smell amazing. People are fascinated by them. Yeah, the way that is all, I've seen all these contraptions where people will like rig their trellis up so that you could like lower the top line and easily get them. Really, just, you should grow them on coir twine, which is the string that everyone uses to grow hops in America. You just cut the string and then bring the string somewhere where people can sit at a table and pick it off. It's very simple. You have to put the string up every year, but you're gonna kind of have to do something like that anyway. So just cut it down. The way the strings work is like, the plant grows up it, but they're, disposable once a year use. You just cut them at the bottom, cut them at the top, and now you have this mobile pile of hops that you can go bring to wherever, whether it's a picking machine or a bunch of people.
Yeah. Gotcha. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about, because I know the farm, you guys were hit with a huge weather event. That was kind of the end of your farm. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Here's another reason maybe that you want to think about long and hard before you get into hops commercially. It's very unlikely that your state has a crop insurance program that works for your hop farm.
I had questions about that.
We are all very familiar with some of the programs that the USDA has, or at least we've heard of. Programs the USDA has for uninsurable or non-insurable crop insurance. Those do not work very well for perennials, or especially hops or growing perennial farms, like farms that are increasing in perennial acreage. There's some challenges with those programs, and so those are not very good options. And then there was nothing on the private market, even if we looked far and wide, and we went to places where it's just like money for money insurance markets, and we couldn't get it. And so ultimately we had a really big storm at the really bad time, and it destroyed a significant portion of both our crop and a larger percentage, because they're valuable, high yielding parts of our field that were destroyed. And that was enough for it to be over. So that's, another cautionary trail for hops.
Yeah, you just had too much invested, too much out. There just wasn't the return on investment to try to keep going.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, the I don't even remember the percentage of revenue loss that we had.
Yeah.
But
it was catastrophic. Yeah. So, all right. So that's again, a cautionary tale, which is good to know. We actually have, I think, 7 hops planted here on the farm, on the south side of our house. And the goal there is that they will just shade the house during the summer. And again, whatever we use, if we do end up harvesting some hops off of it, great. If not, I'm just more interested in the vines growing up and being able to talk about it, how cool it is. But yeah, and I actually forget what variety we have. I was trying to look that up while we were talking, but I can't find the email of what I got. But yeah, so talk a little bit about what are you doing these days?
Yeah, well, today I have a day job where I work with GrownBy and Farm Generations Cooperative as our national co-op organizer. We're a farmer-owned online marketplace. And with regards to hops, I do hop consulting, on the side after the day job was over. So I love the plan. I love the space. I love, I'm enamored with it still. And so that's where I work with brewers and farmers and merchants, hop farmers and merchants on whatever I can help them with.
Gotcha. So
primarily marketing, primarily sensory planning, strategy,
Yeah.
product development stuff.
Because there just is so much to know about the plant, as you were saying.
Yeah, and the plant and the market, I am focused more on the, marketing or sales or planning aspects, and not as much, I'm not an agronomist.
Yeah.
I couldn't answer specific questions about which inputs to be using or the impact they might have or what to do with X and Y is happening.
Yeah. Gotcha. So let's swing over a little bit to the business side of what you were that you were running. What was the yearly cycle look like? I mean, I'm assuming like there was a time period that you had to like open the fields up and train the plants, and then it was kind of going to just, pause more, just kind of like plants are going to grow, and then it was all harvesting. Or talk us through like a year on a hop farm.
Yeah, so at a larger farm like ours, and in Minnesota, spring starts late comparatively. That was one of the challenges growing in Minnesota. Plants didn't have as much time to get started, but let's say we're stringing in late April or May, and we're training in May. So stringing is when you put the strings up, and then training is when you train the hops up the string.
Yep.
And then after everything is strung, which is usually 1 or 2, maybe sometimes 3 passes of stringing by hand. Training by hand. So everything is on the string. So it's confusing to say stringing and then strung. There's a lot of fun words in here. Also, hops is just a crazy word because it's the plant, it's the product, it's the different forms of hops. People say hops and they could mean a lot of different things.
It's also the industry too. The hops.
It's also the industry. Yep, it's fun. It's confusing. And then once you've got the plants trained onto the string, or strung, if you will, then it's the maintenance and growing. So that's for us, and even in an organic system, you'd be in there applying fertilizer or nutrients or pest or disease management on a generally weekly basis, sometimes twice a week, depending on what your analysis is showing for the plant's needs or the stage of growing that you're in. There would also be daily watering. Almost all hops, to be achieving kind of the commercial yields, need to be irrigated. That's usually a drip line at the base of each plant. And so that system would always need managing and fixing. And then come around early August, the initial cones, or they're technically flowers, but they look like cones. People call them hop cones or leaves even. But they don't look like leaves. That's another word that gets tricky here. They start to develop those flowers. And then we would be starting to analyze the flowers for subjective and objective measures of maturity, which is another thing. No one can really tell you exactly when to harvest your hops, but they can become over mature. And then we would start harvesting about, I think every year it was August 23rd is when we started harvesting our first variety, which was always Centennial hops, which is an earlier ripening variety. And then harvest would last through, to us, like mid to late September, never like past that. Sometimes in Minnesota it can get too cold and you can from some frost damage. The longer the hops hang, the more damage they can get to, because you can't get in there. Disease will start to set in. But then harvest happens. Harvest is a wild, for us, 20 to 30 day window of mostly 24-hour days. Someone is always there, because when you're picking, someone needs to be many people are running the picking machine and bringing plants into the picking machine. At the same time, you need to be drying and managing the drying process, and managing the conditioning process, and managing the baling process. Once they're dried, they get put into bales, and then those bales get put into a freezer. And then after all that is done, you start pelleting, taking the bales back out of the freezer, running them through the pelleting process, and packaging them. Harvest is actually absolutely insane on a hop farm.
I can imagine. Yeah.
It's the trade-off of not being maybe as insane during July, relatively schedulable tractor work, comparatively to 30 days of 24/7. Something is happening at the farm all the time, with significant implications. If you dry them too much, you toast them, they're done. If you don't dry them enough, they'll rot in the bale. If you don't X, Y, or Z, your entire harvest can be completely shot to heck.
Yeah. So then the machines to take the leaves or hops off the plants is like you bring it. It's in the building, so you have to bring the plants to it.
Yep. There are some hop farms out west in the more commercial spaces that have plants and machines developed for harvesting in the field. They pick in the field and then sort. But for most, what we're talking about here, and for like farms, even up to my scale, it's a stationary combine essentially that picks and sorts the flowers from the leaves and the stems, and the flowers go one way for further processing, and the leaves and the stems get chopped up for compost.
Gotcha. And then what size of bales do you typically put them in? Is it like a big bale, or is it more of a smaller? What's that typically?
They're like a wrapped bale. So they go into a specific hot bale wrap. That's like a white, white or cream colored, plastic sort of deal. And for us, our bales were 200 pounds.
Okay.
Regardless of your size, baling is just an important step of making this volume. If you imagine a big pile of dried leaves, dried flowers, that is a huge volume to try to store anywhere. So baling just compresses that into a way that's maybe stackable, or at least more handleable for either packaging for sales or further processing. So that's the importance of the baling step. So if you're thinking about a smaller operation or whatever, your bales don't have to always be 200 pounds or 100 pounds or 300 pounds. A bale is just a way to improve and not improve, but kind of make it possible to store these things.
Yeah, absolutely. Now drying, what temperature do you have to be for drying, or is it a variable drying depending on where you are in the process?
That's one of the points of a lot of debate, a lot of information, a lot of research, a lot of opinion. Hop industry, even at the biggest scale, is not enormous. There's maybe 100 hop farming families in America or in the Pacific Northwest. So it's personal and opinionated, and ego is present. It's really fun. So to answer that question though, right now, I would say like 140 degrees Fahrenheit is a fair place to start. You start to get hotter, you start to lose some quality. Some people will say anything above 100 is damaging the quality. I don't know. The most recent research suggests that 140 is just fine. When we were growing, we were trying to be sub 120 because that's what we thought was the best at the time. That was, 3 or 4 years ago now. So about 140, but you don't want to be hot. Hot really will toast them.
Gotcha. Okay. Very cool. Joining me is Dan from Steward, a mission-driven financial partner for farms across the U.S. Dan, farmers typically look for funding and a financial partner when they decide to scale their business. Why is that?
Farms that are scaling, that's a farm that's dialed in their products, their markets. Now they need to grow their production. So they need equipment, they need land, they need labor, they need all the pieces to really scale up production and meet market demand. That's when capital is really needed for farms. Prior to that, farms can use limit funds and tend to get their business going. But once they've established their market, it's about raising funding or having other resources that can help really scale the business. In a lot of circumstances, we've taken farms that had been small operations and really helped them grow to get to where they hope to be. One good example is Fisheye Farms in Detroit. They were farming on a 1/10 of an acre lot, an urban farm, and we helped them fund 2 acres of land, wash and pack station, equipment, utilities, water. And that whole system let them grow from about 10,000 revenue to over 150,000 3 years later. So where I see the real opportunity in regenerative agriculture are these farms that they've got their production going, the demand is really in place, and how can they get the resources then to take the next step and get the business to the viability that it can be.
Yeah, originally it's like they've got the proven model, the proven idea, and they just need that little extra to help grow it. And I think it's important to talk about how the model at Steward works. Give us a little bit of an overview of what the model looks like when they go out for funding.
So Steward, the difference between Steward is that we focus solely on regenerative agriculture, funding these types of farms, and the funds are raised through our platform from individuals who are making contributions to the loan that we make to the farmer. So the Steward was built for accessibility to broaden who's able to fund agriculture. By changing who can fund it, it changed what types of products can be available to farmers, the types of financing that's out there. So it's about aligning the financing with the needs of the farm. And in particular, for these types of farms that need to grow and scale, you need the right type of funding. You need to give them the time to grow the business before having to make payments. And so the kind of flexibility around designing for this type of farmer is really what Steward was built for.
Absolutely. If you are looking for a non-traditional, mission-driven financial partner who understands the business of regenerative agriculture, reach out to gosteward.com today. Now let's talk the business side of the farm. How many people did you have working there?
Full-time year-round, there were about 3 or 4 of us.
Okay.
That was me, a farm manager, a sales manager, and ahead of the season, we had a farm crew of like tractor operators of 2 or 3. And then during the season, during the peaks of the season, we worked with the H2A program. And so in the spring and fall, we would have 12 to 15 H2A laborers join the team.
12 to 15. Okay. And how long were they then on farm for?
In the spring for stringing and training, it was roughly a month. And in the fall for harvest, it was roughly a month.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. So that's how you handled that. Because that's the one thing with a hop farm too, is you have these massive variabilities in labor needs.
Yep. Yeah.
So,
we ran the 80 acres with, functionally 2 or 3 people for most of the growing season. It's just for 2 months of the year, you need a lot of hands.
Yeah. Gotcha. And I think you did say something there a little bit ago, is most of the hops are grown in the Pacific Northwest?
Yeah, the average hop farm in America is about 350, 400 acres. Over half of those acres are in Washington State in the Yakima Valley.
Mm-hmm.
The next largest acreage is in the Willamette Valley in Oregon, and then coming up third, but real close to Oregon, is Idaho, near Parma, Idaho. And then there's one really big farm way north in Idaho.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Gotcha.
primarily Washington, Yakima Valley.
And then is that the majority of the hops used in the US are coming from these farms? There's also a pretty large import. Yeah,
there's, we're all aware that other countries grow hops, and we're very familiar with like the Bavarian hop growing region in Germany, or some people are familiar with the Czech growing region of hops. People grow hops in France, people grow hops in Britain, people grow hops in China, people grow hops in New Zealand and Australia. Now, increasingly, South America, hops are being grown. So hops are grown all over the place. People drink beer all over the place. That's kind of what drives it. But in America, the majority of hops are being grown here just because that's the style that's being brewed. In a hazy IPA, there's an awful lot of hops, and those hops almost all are coming from America, as opposed to, say, a lighter style lager, which might be a German lager, will have German hops in it, most likely, but not very much relative to a big IPA.
Yeah. So that's really interesting too. It's like for every 100 gallons of beer, how many pounds of hops do they put in? I'm sure that varies drastically. Yeah,
there's data put out every year by the Brewers Association with the average pounds per barrel used in craft beer production. So a barrel is the standard unit.
Yeah,
hovers around 2 pounds per barrel with craft breweries. So that's one way to try to think about it. If you're trying to scope out, like, I think I'm going to grow 1,000 pounds a year. So that'd be about 1,000 to 500 barrels of craft beer. Although that ranges wildly, depends on how the brewer is going to use it. Those big hazy IPAs can be 7 or 8 pounds per barrel.
Gotcha.
And the lighter lagers can be half a pound per barrel.
Yeah. So. And a barrel is how many gallons?
A barrel is 2 kegs. So if you can think of what a keg is, I don't know how many gallons a barrel
I'm not a beer drinker, so I don't really know, unfortunately. I like growing things. Let's just look that up here. A keg of beer is 2.5 gallons, maybe. That doesn't make sense.
That's not enough.
How many gallons in?
Because it's going to tell you the number of ounces in a keg, right?
Okay, no, it's a half barrel is 15.5 gallons. So then a barrel would be 30 gallons. Okay, all right. So there we go. That's what we've got the details now on that. Interesting. And
so then, it's a lot of beer.
Yeah.
Right. Because if you're a home brewer or a beer drinker, when you brew 5 gallons of homebrew, it takes you a while to get through that. It's like 50-ish bottles, and it's a lot of beer.
Yeah, like a half barrel is 124 pints.
So when you went to keggers, that's how many pints were in that keg.
Yes. Yeah. All right. So then, and so when you started the business, and we always ask people like, what would they have done different? Would you have, obviously you had it sounds like a fun run at the hops farm, and you, after a while, you had a storm and it wasn't viable. Would you have changed how you built it? I think you mentioned earlier, maybe you would have done R&D for significantly longer.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that we would do differently. I mean, the first thing, but the overall thing would be to be way less, ask for way more help. There were definitely people out there who we could have found for free or for pay that would have helped us avoid some of the significant problems that we made. Of the 80 acres, maybe 40 or 50 were in varieties that we had any business trying to grow, that there was any market for, there's any potential to have a yield that was financially viable. Someone could have told us that.
Yeah.
Someone could have helped us learn how to grow them better more quickly, because people grow these hops, like people grow hops commercially in America. There's hundreds of them. Each farm has at least one, they have one super manager, but then there are many other people who know how to grow hops commercially, and could have asked any of them to try to avoid some of the challenges that we went through in the early seasons of managing weeds and managing nutrients and managing water. That's the number one, challenge, was feeling like we needed to present this idea that we knew it all in order to secure the financial support that we got from a business partner. And I think that's something that we would definitely have done differently. Is hey, we know X, Y, and Z, but we don't know a whole lot of other stuff, and we're gonna go find out before we get too big too fast.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah. So have a better, so because one of the problems, it sounds like, is you were spending so much money in R&D, which is that 30, 40 acres of stuff you didn't actually harvest anything from, that, you weren't able to have enough buffer to try to weather bigger challenges.
Well, not exactly. I would just say that it took us a number of years to get to the point where we were getting to a commercially viable yield on enough of our acreage. And those early years of not making money, really didn't leave a lot of room for error once we figured out what we were doing for a storm to come.
Correct. Gotcha. Yeah.
If we could have learned more quickly, gotten to a more successful operation more soon, sooner. Maybe things would have been different when that storm came,
Yeah. And that storm pretty much just knocked everything over because of the high winds.
Yeah, it was, like I said, well, I didn't say, but it was a straight line wind event at the wrong time. So, I mean, imagine a hop field, and your rows of hops are basically these huge sails that you're building. And a big wind came and started knocking the sails over, and then it was over like dominoes, because once the trellis fails, it kind of all starts to snap and break. And then once they're on the ground, they go bad really fast. The timing was bad, is it happened right. These fields were going to be harvested in the next couple of weeks. So they were at their heaviest. They were at their most valuable, almost. There wasn't time. Like if it happened early this summer, we might be able to go in and prop up and fix the trellis enough that it could still be harvested normally. And the hops if it was early spring, there would have been no weight, and the wind would have just blown through the trellises. So bad things happen.
Yeah, it was the worst possible thing that could have happened at the worst possible time. Yeah. Well, Eric, mention GrownBy a little bit more, because you mentioned that you work with them now, and a lot of what GrownBy does is it's a farmer co-op for CSA sales software, right?
Yeah. Yep. A CSA sales are really any direct-to-consumer sale that your farm might be doing.
Yeah. And what do you work with them on? What's your role there?
Yeah, so I'm the national co-op organizing lead. I work with farmers to share the news about GrownBy. We do co-op development education sessions, and generally, help farmers understand what it is we're offering with our platform, how it can or may not fit their farm well, and if they want to explore that more, helping them, work with the software, learn how it works. Ultimately, I see my role as kind of a steward or I guess more of a communicator. I can access our software engineers and the real tech people who can add features or solve challenges that farms are having, but also out there talking to farms of what their needs are and how it's working for them or not, or what they need from a platform. Or really, I really like, one part of my job I really like is just helping farmers think through, what is the right software platform for you. I mean, I think that's, if I have any advice, like, it's do your research and take your time and talk to people, talk to the different, there's a lot of software platforms out there for farms, and there's probably going to continue to be more. There's a lot of interest in bringing tech to ag. And for us smaller farms and direct to consumer farms, it can be really tricky. That I don't really think anyone's really figured out exactly how to do that, and reach this niche that's so much smaller. There's examples of tech going to ag and supporting corn production or whatever. That's a huge industry with a lot of money and a lot of margin to be harvested, if you will. But I think it's very different for direct to farmer software sales. And so if a farmer, I think, is looking at that, I really recommend y'all do your research, talk to the people behind the products that you're looking for, take your time in making the right decision, because it's none of them are going to fit you perfectly unless the stars have aligned. Every software has its own decisions built into it that can't be changed. And also, once you choose one, it's a lot of work to stop using one and go to another one, even if there's no cost, like direct costs associated with that.
Correct.
Moving your customers is a lot.
Payment
having them get
profiles.
used to a different website where they go to log in can be a lot for some of your customers. Some people are very uncomfortable putting their credit card on the internet still, and that's okay. So there's a lot to consider. And I my biggest fear or worry is or it makes me sad when I see a farm that they sign up for a thing, they committed to a thing, and now it's just not right. That they're not being supported how they need, or it turns out it didn't really have the features that they hoped or thought or were told it had. And that's a tricky spot for you to be with your, with a marketing platform for your business. So, I'm always happy to talk to someone about GrownBy and what our software and our service is like. And if it's not right for you, I'm not going to bother you or be sad.
The other thing you can look at is the level of support that comes with the software, because if you don't have, people need to order their product, but if you don't have a support for 48 hours, I mean, that's a lot of time that goes by in a week. So that's something we've run into with some of the software, and currently is just trying to get support, and it's been very challenging.
Yeah, we're excited. So we're adding another full-time support person soon.
That's awesome. Yeah, very cool. Yeah. Well, Eric, I appreciate your time today. Thanks so much for sharing about your background. And I know it's never always the easiest thing to talk about, I guess you wouldn't call it a failed business, but a business that had to be shut down. But I think, what we were able to cover today was just here's what the industry looks like. Here's the opportunities. Here's where you may want to or may not want to get involved. And it's one of those things that sounds like either you're going to be very small and do something alternative with it, like you mentioned, the U-pick, or you're going to be very big and you're going to have a tremendous amount of effort behind you. But it sounds like too, that a lot of these established hop farms are multi-generational and have been doing it for a very long time. And that's how they make it work.
Yeah, it's a real tricky space. There's not a lot of room in the middle for hops. And, I'm happy to talk about my hop experience. It was incredibly difficult losing the farm, because it wasn't just a business. I mean, it was a farm business, and farms are another level of personal to a lot of businesses in my experience. And that was an incredibly difficult time and a long journey out of, the fog and the depression and the sadness and the grief of losing that. But, I also know now that, bad things can happen, good things happen from them. It's going to be okay. I'm happier now than I was during that time. And, it's just, it was an incredibly valuable life experience and part of my, a huge part of who I am as a farmer and, the person I am. So, it was really hard, but everyone out there who's farmed for long enough, you have stories of losing a crop to something you can't control. And I think it's a nice reminder that we don't control everything and that sometimes things happen and we need to just deal with how we, handle how we deal with it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again, Eric. Can't wait to share this with the audience.
Hey, Thriving Farmers listeners. Are you putting a ton of time and money into making your Shopify or Wix work for your farm's needs? These website builders work great when you're selling t-shirts, but for a spring plant sale or CSA share over a season, it's a lot of work and can get pretty expensive. That's why farmers like me decided to come together and build GrownBy, a cooperatively owned farm sales platform that fits our business model, reduces our costs, and saves us time. I'm Lindsay Lusher-Shute, co-founder of GrownBy and farmer. This year, we used GrownBy at my farm to sell CSA shares, cheese and egg shares, turkeys at Thanksgiving, fall lamb, seasonal pies, and quite a bit more. We even accepted donations for our subsidized community shares. GrownBy is our complete farm store. It processes payments, beautifully handles proration, installment payments, manages custom orders, and add-on shares. GrownBy generates pick lists, sign-in sheets, packing sheets, and handles order notifications for our customers. Listeners to the Thriving Farmers podcast get 50% off their first 3 months on GrownBy. Just email us at GROW at farmgenerations.coop to get this offer, and Michael will link to us in today's show notes. You can find us at grownby.com or on the Google Play or Apple App Stores under GrownBy, GROWNBY. I look forward to seeing your farm on GrownBy this season.
So there you have it, another episode in the books. So I'd love if you would hop on over to iTunes and leave us a rating and a review. Those mean everything to us. We love to hear what you're thinking. If you have a podcast guest that you can recommend, please pop on over to the Thriving Farmer Podcast website and leave us a review. That's thrivingfarmerpodcast.com.